Sometimes when an atheist says to a Christian that God doesn't exist or that there's no evidence that God exists, in response the Christian will say to the atheist that they have to prove God doesn't exist or give evidence that there's no evidence. In other words, the Christian will say that the atheist carries a burden of proof. But is the Christian justified in saying this? Is it even a prudent move to make? Burden of proof simply refers to the obligation to prove one's assertions. So the primary question we're interested in here is, if someone claims God does not exist or makes some equivalent claim, do they have to prove that? Here's another way to think about burden of proof within the context of a debate over the existence of God. So, if the Christian is the only one that carries a burden of proof, then in order to win the debate, they have to prove God exists or give sufficient evidence, or whatever term you like. Whereas, it's the atheist's job to merely prevent that from happening. They don't have to prove atheism true, they just have to prevent the Christian from proving that God exists. That's the position many atheist counter-apologists take. Whereas, if both parties carry a burden of proof, as many Christian apologists would claim, then it wouldn't be enough for the atheist to merely refute the arguments of their opponent. They would have to prove atheism true. And now, many atheists object to this and say that even the phrase "prove atheism true" is nonsensical because atheism isn't even a belief or a claim, but rather a lack thereof. And that brings us to a related question: what is an atheist? Because both sides of this burden of proof debate presuppose a particular definition of atheist, and it's that definition that they build their argument on. And so what I'll do is I'll give a brief sketch of each side of the debate, and then I'll give my own take on this, which will make nobody happy and everyone upset. Alright, now, here's basically how each side would define the word atheist. You ready? You ready for this? So, many atheists will say that an atheist is someone that doesn't believe God exists, and many Christians will say that an atheist is someone that believes God doesn't exist. Yeah, those were two different definitions. This is what this is all about. This is what the debate is. Here's the difference. As was briefly mentioned before, the atheist counter-apologist definition of atheist refers to a lack of belief, whereas the typical Christian apologist definition refers to a belief. And so if we think about it within the context of a God debate, if atheism is a belief and they're making a knowledge claim about the way reality is, then it would only make sense that they should provide some kind of reason for us to accept their claim about reality, just like the Christian would give reasons for everyone to accept their claims about reality. But if atheism is a lack of belief, then there's just not even any knowledge claim that's being made, and so it would be nonsensical to say that they have to defend their belief because there is no belief. Now I have to nuance that a little bit, because even atheists that make claims about reality and say there is no God and so forth, they would say that because it's a negative claim, they're saying something does not exist, that therefore they don't have to prove anything, that they don't carry a burden of proof. And so sometimes it's sort of the lack of belief route, sometimes it's the negative claim route, same consequence either way. But that's basically the difference between someone that believes God doesn't exist and someone that doesn't believe God exists. Or was that what I said? Yeah, something like that. The last time such a small change in wording made such a big difference was when the Catholics were debating the Eastern Orthodox over the filioque. Is anyone gonna get this? No. Now that we've seen how the definition of atheist sorta kinda affects the burden of proof debate, let's go back to our original question and look at the kind of analogies that each side uses to show how their position is like the obviously correct one. So on the atheist counter-apologist side that say atheists don't carry a burden of proof and that theists do carry a burden of proof, they'll say, you believe that unicorns don't exist, but it would be absurd if someone said that you need to prove unicorns don't exist. And we can just multiply these kinds of examples, right? Just think of anything that you believe doesn't exist, any kind of fictional thing whatsoever. And so the implication would be that if we're going to say that atheists carry a burden of proof for saying that God doesn't exist, then we'd have to bite the bullet and say, all right, well, now we have to prove that unicorns don't exist in order to say that. So this would almost certainly be the more sensible position, right? I mean, who would want to go through the trouble of proving the non-existence of all the things that we believe don't exist? Okie doke. So then on the other side of the debate, the Christians that say atheists do carry a burden of proof for saying God doesn't exist, they'll say, look, if I were to say that aliens don't exist, you would probably expect me to give some kind of reason for that. Or what if I believed that the external world did not exist? Wouldn't you expect me to give some reason to believe that? And so likewise, this is just another one of those things. If you say God doesn't exist, then you have to give a reason for that. Now, granted, I still have to give a reason for my claim, and I know that you have some Christians that say that they don't carry a burden of proof at all and it's all on the atheist. That's not really the position I'm talking about here. What I've seen most from Christian apologists is that both parties carry a burden of proof. Alright, now that was a lot to take in, so what do we make of all this? You could just look up the opinion of a professional philosopher, or stick around to hear the opinion of a guy on the internet. I'm sure someone's dying to hear what I have to say about this. At least my mom, although she did unsubscribe from me. First, when it comes to the definition of atheist, there's a sense in which both parties are correct, because atheism can be an umbrella term that refers to everyone that is not a theist, and then one of the subcategories under the umbrella would be atheist in the more specific sense, which would be someone that believes God does not exist. And so I would not say that an atheist carries a burden of proof simply because they're an atheist, because they could be somewhere else under the umbrella. And let's say someone says that they don't know if God exists, but they still want to call themselves an atheist. That's fine by me. I know a lot of Christians will spend so much effort trying to get atheists to relabel themselves as agnostic. Personally, I just never understood this. As far as I'm concerned, I'm going to use the same arguments for my own position, regardless of how my interlocutor identifies. So if they prefer atheist, if they prefer agnostic, it really just makes no difference to me. Whatever floats your goat, man. For me, it comes down to whether or not they're making a claim about reality, and it has less to do with how they identify and even how they define the word atheist. And so I can just grant, for the sake of argument, whatever definition of atheist they prefer. So what about when an atheist claims that God does not exist, or that there's no evidence that God exists? I would say that they do carry a burden of proof for this, because if they're claiming to know something about the way reality is, then they need to give a reason for other people to accept that claim, and it can't just be a baseless assertion, even if it's a negative claim. But what actually convinced me about this wasn't even an argument from a Christian apologist, it was more of an experience. So I used to work in fast food, and one night we were having an employee meeting, and the manager said, okay guys, now I get that we close at 10 o'clock, but if you see a customer trying to walk in at 10:05, just let him in. And then one of my coworkers objected and said, well, this is ridiculous. There is not a single restaurant in the entire city that has a rule like that. And then I had the thought, how could they possibly know this? Now, I didn't actually bring this up to them because it really doesn't matter, but imagine if I had said that to them and then they say something like, well, that's a negative claim, so I don't have to give any evidence for that. Would that actually be satisfying? Or what if they said something like this? Well, what do you expect me to do? You want me to go to every restaurant in the city at their closing time and then try to walk in the doors or see if they have a rule like that? That's a ridiculous thing to request. And to that I would just say, no, I don't expect that. I would just expect you to not make claims you know you have no way of substantiating. And so likewise, a common retort you hear from the counter-apologist is something like, well, what do you expect me to jump in a rocket ship and travel to every part of the cosmos making sure there's no gods anywhere? That's a ridiculous thing to request. But I would just say no, I would just expect you to not make a claim if you know you have no way of substantiating it. Which, by the way, you certainly could give some reason to believe the proposition God does not exist. You could give the problem of evil or those divine attribute paradoxes or whatever. So I don't think it's a particularly unreasonable request to make. That is evidence that God does not exist. So then what do we make of the counter analogies about the unicorns and all those fictional creatures? Do we have to prove unicorns don't exist? Well, these analogies are actually kind of sneaky because it's not as if we merely lack a belief that unicorns exist. We have reasons for believing they don't. Some reasons that Jimmy Akin gives are they are claimed to be corporeal beings, but you have never seen one with your own eyes. You can't find photos of them in biology textbooks. Biologists don't hold them to exist. Most people regard them as fictional. And we could just think of all sorts of reasons to believe unicorns don't exist. And I'll link that article in the description because Jimmy Akin elaborates more on this idea that negative claims don't carry a burden of proof. Furthermore, when we talk about unicorns as though they're fictional, it's generally understood that whoever we're talking to already agrees with us. Similar to how when a pastor wants to give a sermon on God's love, they're making the assumption that God exists because it's understood that the congregation that he is preaching to already believes that God exists. And so they're not going to begin the sermon like, here's an argument for the existence of God. And likewise, when we talk about unicorns as though they're fictional, it's understood that we're preaching to the choir, as it were. And so of course no one feels compelled to give evidence that unicorns don't exist. I also think the reason why analogies like this can seem compelling on the face of it is that the counter-apologists will sometimes have a conception of God that's like a man on a cloud in the sky, and that's a lot closer to the category of unicorn, but I digress. Now, I did say that everyone was going to be upset with this, and so now that I've incurred the wrath of the YouTube atheists, next comes the part where I get excommunicated by the YouTube Christians. While it's true that if someone claims God does not exist, they would carry a burden of proof, I nevertheless grant for the sake of argument that they wouldn't. There are two reasons why I do this. The first is that it's not necessary for the atheist to carry a burden of proof for that particular claim in order for me to get my own argument off the ground. When debating the existence of God, there are some things we can grant for the sake of argument and some things we can't. So take for example something like scientism, the claim that science alone gives us genuine knowledge. Now my argument is philosophical in nature, so before I can even get my argument off the ground, I would have to refute scientism if that's the claim that they're making. But now think about someone that believes the universe has always existed. Well, that's the kind of thing that I can just grant for the sake of argument. Now I don't think that's actually true, but the point being, it doesn't make any difference as far as my argument is concerned. Now, unless you're making that one argument where you're not able to do that, then you can just grant for the sake of argument that the universe always existed, and it doesn't really make a difference. And so I see atheists not carrying a burden of proof in this latter category where whether they think they do or they don't, it really just doesn't make a difference as far as my own argument is concerned. And if all I have to do in order to win the debate is give a cogent argument for the existence of God, and if I'm able to do that without going down the rabbit hole of who carries a burden of proof, then why wouldn't I just do that? The second reason goes back to the point I made in my first video where you have all of these people that were raised in Christian homes, but they never really had their questions answered, and so they might ask, how do we know that God exists? And the kind of answer they would get back is, well, it's all just faith, and you need to not question your faith, etc., etc. And so I think you have many people that are not even aware that anyone is even claiming that there's a rational approach to the existence of God, that God can be known by natural reason apart from faith. Furthermore, by going with the typical Christian apologist strategy of getting the atheist to carry their burden of proof and, give evidence that God doesn't exist, I think that can give the impression that we just have no reason to believe God exists. And that can perpetuate the stereotype that all Christians just take this on blind faith. Now granted, An atheist may not be justified in making that kind of inference just because you're trying to get them to carry their burden of proof, but nevertheless, if we're able to avoid giving misconceptions, then I think it's more prudent to go that route. Now granted, your mileage may vary. I'm not saying that every atheist was raised in a fundamentalist Christian household, or that every atheist is going to have this misconception that there's just no arguments for God or anything like that. These are just some of the considerations I take into account. Now let me address a possible misunderstanding. I don't have any problem with wanting to figure out where your interlocutor is coming from and asking them questions about how they came to whatever conclusion they came to. And so when someone says God doesn't exist or there's no evidence for God, my first response is not going to be an argument for the existence of God. I'm going to figure out more of where they're coming from, because it could be the case, right, that their big beef with Christianity is that Christians are bad people, there's contradictions in the Bible or whatever. And so in a situation like that, it wouldn't even be a good idea to jump immediately into the argument for God, because it may not be the foremost thing on their mind. But there's a difference between that and putting your foot down, saying that if you're going to say that there is no God, then you have to substantiate that claim, where the God debate then morphs into the burden of proof debate. Before I summarize my position, let me just make one more point to say that I totally get why most Christian apologists don't take this position, especially when you're dialoguing with an atheist that's being really arrogant and they think they found this loophole where as long as they make negative claims, then they can just make whatever baseless assertion they want, and you just want them to back up their baseless assertion. So I totally get that. Ultimately, this is really more of a prudential judgment, and I just happen to have different considerations, so. Okay, now to summarize. My definition of atheist is super weird and complicated, largely inconsequential, because what's really important is whether someone is claiming that God doesn't exist or making some equivalent claim. When they do that, I do think they carry a burden of proof. However, because of a prudential judgment, I grant for the sake of argument that they don't. The reasons being, one, it's not necessary that they do in order for me to get my argument off the ground, and two, the strategy that most other apologists take might perpetuate the stereotype that we all just take this stuff on blind faith. Okay, that's it. Bye-bye.